So I'm here again with Lee Jackson, our top financial and stock writer, who's been with us for 15 years and has been the top guy for 15 years. Today we're going to talk about what we call the new big three. That would be Tesla, GM, and Ford. Chrysler is gone, American Motors. We'll get into that in a second. But what's interesting is we decided to do this on a day when Tesla stock is down by almost 30% for the year. They've just announced what is for them horrible earnings and warned that this year is really going to be worse. So let me first get your reaction, since we're going to basically go from the 60s all the way through to Tesla today.
That's something we're more than qualified to do.
We're qualified to do, but let me get your reaction first to Tesla. What announced last night after the market, just getting killed right now.
You know, it's the same old story, Doug. I mean, there's so much hype involved that if there is a slowdown in sales growth or slowdown in anything, every short seller in the world says, okay, now's the time to lean on it. It had a pretty good run through the end of last year. And it doesn't look like, based upon what they've said, that things are going to improve maybe until 25, which could lead for a lot more selling.
Right. And that's what they were up over 100% last year.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
For people who don't know this, Tesla is worth about $700 billion. Maybe with the adjustment, it's a little bit less than that. Ford and GM are each have a market cap of about $50 billion.
Right.
And I'm going to get into the fact in a second of what that may say, but I'm now going to take you back in a way that only Lee and I can do to when we were young children.
In the northern Detroit suburbs.
We were both just far enough north of Detroit, but we could get down there in 15 minutes. And at that point, you had Pontiac, Michigan, Flint. There were huge car plants in these places where there's no one now. But you really had Chrysler, the number 3 car company, but big, important company.
Sure.
You had Ford, which is obviously was the most famous of these car companies, was founded turn of the last century. And then General Motors, which had 50% market share in the car market. 50% of all cars sold in the United States were sold by GM. Really, Lee, the only foreign cars, or imports as they were called then, that had any position in the United States then was VW.
At that juncture, yeah, it was the late 60s and the early 70s before Toyota, Honda started to make an impact. And the big three at the time just looked the other way. They were like, they can't possibly compete. They can't possibly have anything that's even in the ballpark. And that lack of vision, and, you know, people like Iacocca had vision in 1964, and apparently by 1970, that vision was gone. And they were so quickly slaughtered that by the mid 70s, it had all turned around.
Right. So I'm going to guess right now that if you take all the Japanese car companies, they probably have a 25% market share in the United States. GM is down by itself from 50 to about 16. You go 60s to now.
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
So if you look at what happened, Japanese come into the United States and they get this great windfall, which is the Arab oil embargo. And suddenly they have what Detroit doesn't have. They have cars that get phenomenal gas mileage. And Detroit doesn't. Detroit didn't believe in really small cars with good gas mileage. So that was their first boost, wasn't it? What I would describe as a little bit of a lucky play.
Yeah, and I was working at the Marathon station just south of 15 Mile on Woodward when gas went to 30 cents a gallon, and it was hard to come by. And there was lines down Woodward of people pulling up to get gasoline, and for cars that got 8 to 10 miles a gallon. There was a lot of V8s still around, and it was a huge windfall, and they took advantage of it.
what happens next is that it starts to occur to the U.S. consumer that Japanese cars, in many cases, are higher quality than the U.S. cars they're used to buying. And, Car and Track, J.D. Powers, a lot of these people who have important opinions about cars say, well, listen, these cars are way better than what they're making at GM and Ford. So people were looking at them and saying, I'm going to consider a Japanese car now. And at that point, the cost to manufacture those Japanese cars was way below what it was in the United States because of the UAW.
And they've had another UAW turnaround recently where they pin them in the corner, like we've seen them do in the past, in the 60s and 70s. And they've taken a swollen corporate budgets at all the big three, actually big 2.5. And it'll be interesting to see, because the next time they can't really afford another contract in 4 years like the one they just signed, or they're doomed.
Right. So we're now moving a little bit further forward. We're sort of into the 80s, early 90s, and the Japanese decide, something, we're going to beat up on Cadillac and Lincoln now. So the Japanese car companies, Toyota launches Lexus, high-end brand. You've got Infiniti is part of Nissan.
Right. That's their gold standard. Right.
And Acura was Honda.
Right.
Suddenly, the very, very profitable high-end Lincoln and Cadillacs, now they've got a problem, and somebody's eating their lunch.
And horrible design issues too. I mean, they had horrible design issues all the way through into the 90s for both companies.
Yeah, and then people say to themselves, it isn't a Toyota, it's a Lexus.
That's right.
As you know, within the car companies, the difference between a luxury model and the base model is a lot of it's just the wood and, nicer hubcaps and stuff.
Yeah, well, and the interiors are spiffed up a little bit, but yeah, exactly.
So now you've got and by the way, Lincoln and Cadillac sell almost no cars. If you look at the lineup in terms of luxury car sales in the United States, Lexus, BMW, and Mercedes dominate that market. And that's
absolutely.
That's where we haven't talked about the Germans, but that's where the Germans come in. They come in, and as the Japanese are basically attacking the low mid part of the market, BMW and Mercedes early, they come in and suddenly everybody thinks a German luxury car is the best luxury car in the world.
Yes, they did.
And it worked. Each of those car companies sells probably 300,000 cars in the year in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's about right. Yeah.
They make good margins, and you see their intelligence. The car plants in the South, right, not unionized. So one of the things that the German car companies said was, well, if we're going to build cars in the United States, we're going to build them in places where the UAW, it doesn't exist. It doesn't have
so-called right-to-work states.
So the right-to-work states suddenly have all these car plants. And in the meantime, Detroit, which was a city of 1.5 million people in 1960, empties out all the companies, all the people, middle class, upper class. Detroit's now a city of about 622,000 with a poverty rate of 35%.
Yeah, it's bad. Although there's been a degree of a rebirth, especially in Woodward and downtown, and a lot of it was because of people trying to gentrify downtown Detroit, which I guess has worked to some degree.
Yeah. So let's take another step forward. We're now like early 2010s. Guess who shows up? The South Koreans. All of a sudden,
in a big
Hyundai and Kia, who are part of a massive conglomerate in South Korea. I mean, if they were here, it would be like a Fortune 20 company, come into the market, and they do what the Japanese did. They undercut the market again on price. They come in even below the Japanese and low-end American cars. So now you've got another group of people, And these cars are starting to get awesome reviews. So you've got
and the early models were, the early Hyundai models, Doug, if you remember, they were hideous. And I remember thinking at the time, this is never going to work. And then the transformation, I mean, even Kia has changed their logo over the years. And so you're right. They've undercut the Japanese. And it's interesting. My wife and I both own Nissans, and they're made in Mississippi, which is, adjacent here to New Orleans. So, it's a very close drive. And they said the same thing, though, because I said, well, is it better to have one built here or one built in Japan? They go, oh, Japan for sure. And I was somewhat surprised by that, but that's literally what the sales guy said. And so I was like, well, was this built in Mississippi or Japan? He goes, well, I'm not sure about that.
Did not know. So then they play the Japanese card again. They decide that they want an upscale brand, Genesis. So now the poor guys at Cadillac and Lincoln, there's another company coming at them, and you're now seeing the Genesis automobiles get phenomenal reviews. So you have more competition at the high end of the market.
Absolutely. And you see they've caught on to the playbook of let's sponsor expensive golf tournaments. Let's make sure we're seen by the demographic that can afford this car. And so, so now the market has been divided again by, like you noted, to your point, using the same playbook that everybody used for the last 40 years.
Right. So let me move to about the same time that the South Koreans come in, and all of a sudden Tesla starts into the market, almost goes bankrupt, starts to sell cars in earnest, and it becomes the gold standard for electric cars sometime around 2017, 2018.
Yeah.
Now, nobody wants
8 years.
At that point, you have what are truly early adopters. Electric cars are not something Americans are familiar with. You get this small group of people, and you're now selling tens of thousands of Teslas. Last year, they sold 1.81 million cars. Now, granted, a lot of that was not in the United States, but that's why I